We've had the last FMQs before the election in a half-empty chamber where all the leaders turned it into another campaigning tool. Should they be asking serious questions about issues within their control at Holyrood? 3 polls in just 24 hours on Scottish voting intentions have come out all with different results. How much faith should politicians put in any poll? More people are watching the Euros instead of the TV leaders' debates. Have we all just had enough? I'm Lorna Hughes. This is Planet Holyrood.
It's important we look at the facts.
Politics has to be about service.
A modern form of national service.
The outcome, that's for the voters to decide.
Hi everyone. Well, we've had the last FMQs before the election today, and all the party leaders seem to be using it as a mini campaigning tool. Swinney is saying that Labour's got no credible plan for the NHS, while Douglas Ross says that voters should take the chance to get rid of the SNP on July the 4th. But should Scottish MSPs be using parliamentary time to try and campaign for the general election instead of asking serious questions about issues within their control at Holyrood? Chris, this seems to be kind of almost a weekly occurrence these days, but obviously it's markedly so today.
Yeah, that's right. I was actually sitting in the press gallery in the Scottish Parliament when I was speaking just now, and the chamber, the Scottish Parliament chamber, was half empty at best today. Many MSPs clearly felt that the action was elsewhere and they had no reason to be here in Holyrood, despite the fact that this is actually the last day that Holyrood is sitting before it breaks up for its 2-month-long summer recess. So that gives you an idea that quite a few of the politicians here obviously think that the work is done and they're free to go away and campaign. And what kind of message that sends is open to interpretation. To be fair, though, this was meant to be quite a busy month for the Scottish Government. Before Rishi Sunak announced an election would take place on July 4th, the Scottish Government have been planning to publish its programme for government. That usually happens later in the year, but after John Swinney replaced Humza Yousaf as First Minister, there was a need to kind of get to grips with a new programme for government. But that's now been kicked into long grass. That will be happening until September. And yeah, Holyrood has been a bit of a ghost town for the last sort of 3 or 4 weeks. And sort of interest.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of just faded away, really.
Well, they just seem to be talking about issues that are reserved to Westminster. Certainly in the last few weeks, but it was very, very obvious, obviously, today. Douglas, should they stick to devolved issues and perhaps leave aside, the kind of general election, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the way Chris describes it there, it's got serious last week of school vibes going on, I think. I'm half expecting John Swinney and Douglas Ross to break out the snakes and ladders or something to pass the time before their mums come and pick them up. But I mean, in an ideal world, Lorna, they wouldn't be there discussing reserved issues. I mean, ultimately, it is a parliament. They can discuss, what's on the agenda, and if MSPs want to discuss something, then that is their kind of right. But if I'm being perfectly honest, I don't think this is an issue confined to the past few weeks. MSPs routinely spend time, especially First Minister's questions, when you get pre-prepared SNP almost speeches, the chance to give the SNP First Minister the chance to sound off about Westminster. This isn't confined to the last few weeks. I mean, we have debates about Palestine, we have debates about world events, and these are all really worthy topics, but they're not devolved topics. I mean, we endlessly discuss independence at Holyrood. Independence in the Constitution is not a devolved matter. So, there's an argument made that they shouldn't even be discussing them. But I mean, it's been far more pronounced in the last few weeks. I actually have some sympathy. I don't often come on here and express sympathy for our politicians, but there is a general election campaign going on. as Chris said, a lot of the work at Holyrood said to be kicked into the long grass. In some ways, it's the only show in town. What else are they going to, kind of talk about? In an ideal world, I don't think they should be. In an ideal world, they wouldn't be. But, I can't see many people tuning into FMQs if it was to discuss, the finer points of the Scottish Government today. What people want to hear about is your kind of election pitch and, all eyes on next week. I wonder if is there an argument to be made that, Holyrood should maybe should take a break during a general election period, but obviously this one
controversial, Douglas. Yeah.
This one did come on it is very quickly. It's quite difficult, and obviously the MSPs wouldn't want their 2.5 month holiday that they're about to enjoy eating into by having to go back to maybe pick up some work afterwards. So it's a difficult one, but I can kind of understand it.
There's been accusations and certainly discussions in the past about how Holyrood is set up in terms of, you've talked about kind of scripted answers, and there certainly appears to be the ability for, MSPs of all parties, to be honest, being allowed to read from sheets rather than to react to the questions that they're actually being asked. And certainly a huge amount of time. And I'm sure there are people out there who think it is being wasted. And I'm sure there will be people who will be listening to them today and thinking, well, there are actually, important issues that they could be discussing. Sorry,
I'm just I don't think this is unique to Holyrood either. As somebody who spent quite a number of years covering council meetings, there's an awful lot of issues discussed at council level that have got absolutely nothing to do with the council, and it just seems to be to make councillors feel better about themselves or feel good about themselves or try and influence national politics. So I don't think it's unique to Holyrood.
Chris, do you think that, Parliament is 25 years old now, should we look at that again? Should that be looked at again as to how it's structured? Because I think that's what frustrates a lot of the public, to be honest, particularly who are now able to watch it on television.
I certainly think there are some aspects that could be improved. And you mentioned the scripted answers. I think they are frustrating. I don't want to single out any particular minister because they all have been guilty of doing this at times. But there was a statement on the housing crisis last week from Paul McClellan, and Paul did the best with the script that he'd been provided by his own team of civil servants, presumably. But it was pretty dismal hearing. He was reading the script. There was like a few 2-3 minutes of questions from opposition members, but the whole thing was deeply unsatisfying given the very, very serious nature of the issue that faces Scotland and indeed the rest of the UK. So I feel they have to look at that. It can all feel very wooden at times. FMQs at least can be quite illuminating at times, not every week certainly not today, and quite engaging as well. But that's because you've got the party leaders, you've got the top dogs going at each other. But it shouldn't be like that. All sort of sessions of the Parliament should be treated with seriousness and respect. But to be quite frank, they aren't. Very few MSPs will turn up for certain events, certain debates. They certainly aren't all being reported on. The way we work as journalists, you can't be looking at everything. But certainly, if you're looking at an empty chamber as a member of the public and you're listening to a minister race through an A4 script in front of them and then take maybe 2 or 3 questions before moving on, you're not going to be thinking, oh, they're really getting to grips with the big issues of the day here. I know that the presiding officer, Alison Johnston, she was looking at ways that things could be improved in the chamber. I certainly think, that the onus is on the parties. It's up to them to encourage their politicians to be treating certain things with respect. Because if it comes to, Douglas mentions independence, obviously the big constitutional question. If the SNP, for example, brought a debate on independence, opposition parties would do their damnedest to ignore it. They'd be like, oh, we'll treat this with the contempt it deserves in their eyes. And then vice versa, if the Scottish Conservatives brought a debate on, say, law and order, many SNP MSPs would choose to be elsewhere doing other things. So it all kind of ties in. But I do feel, the last month hasn't been Holyrood at its greatest, but then they do have the excuse of the general election. But after the summer, with a new government, we presume, in power at Westminster, they're going to have to be some pretty hard work quite quickly. I mean, John Swinney alluded to it today. He talked about the NHS, and he said, there's a serious conversation, as he put it, a serious conversation needs to be had with the next UK government about the health service and about how it's going to be funded. So, the school holidays have started, but there'll be a lot of really hard work for them to do come September.
Yeah, it would be nice to see questions being answered and politicians being able to think on their feet and actually react. Because otherwise, as you say, it's very, very wooden. Anyway, we have 3 very different polls that have come out in the last 24 hours on Scottish voting intentions. The latest showing the SNP ahead, another Labour out front, and the third putting both parties neck and neck. But how much should we take from these polls? I mean, if you remember in 2019, the general election, the polls were broadly right. I think it was the first time since about 1955 that they'd been absolutely right. But polling on the number of seats that a party win is notoriously difficult to actually predict. So despite this alleged landslide, Labour landslide across the country, is this just too difficult to call in Scotland at the moment? Douglas, I mean, are things tighter than we think here, or are we not getting the full picture?
The first thing I think I'd say is I think these MRP mega polls should be treated with massive caution. I think one of them, I think the one that you're talking about, Lorna, had Labour winning Berwickshire,
Yes.
And it's kind of like, well, we all know that's that's obviously not going to happen. So I tend to ignore them a little bit. The 2 you're talking about, obviously, one was for the Scotsman, the other one was for Ballot Box Scotland, but I think it's part funded by the Herald. So,
yeah.
I think the thing is they're all the polls are showing broadly the same thing, if we're being honest. Obviously, there was one today, the one for the Scotsman had the SNP and the Labour both on 34%. But that has very much been an outlier. I think I checked. I think it's only 2 in the last 17 I've had them neck and neck, and the other one was Ipsos, which has a tendency to have a higher SNP vote when it does polling for whatever reason. So the other polls, we actually run a wee, in the Express website, I've got a wee poll of polls going where I take like the last 10 and take the kind of average of that, and it's broadly shown Labour with a 3.5% lead in the popular vote, which kind of, when you look at it, that's actually narrowed in the past week or two.
Yeah, I was going to say that does definitely. That's come down.
The SNP, there was a few polling them at 29%, which I think again you can probably discount. But ultimately, while polling isn't an exact science, it is a science. It's people don't just. These numbers aren't just pulled out of someone's bum. People do the research to get them. My own personal feeling is that the election here in Scotland might be tighter. I think it will be tighter than the polls are suggesting. I still suspect that on polling day, the SNP might still emerge as the biggest party in terms of the popular vote, but because Labour's support is so concentrated in the Central Belt, they're going to lose a lot of seats in the Central Belt. But I still feel the SNP can get in the low 20s. I don't know if that's me just kind of trying to temper expectation from a Scottish Express point of view, but I just get that feeling. The one thing I have noticed from the polls as well is I think the reform vote is starting to have an impact, or the potential reform vote is starting to have an impact on the Tories. I've noticed again in a couple of polls, they've dropped about 2 percentage points in a week. And I think that is having an impact. But again, I remain unconvinced that on the day that this reform polling in Scotland is going to manifest itself to 7 or 8% of people actually vote, or those who turn up actually voting for them. So I think we can trust the polls if you take them all kind of together. You can't take one. I mean, the Scotsman poll was taken just 3 days after another Scotsman poll by the same polling company, which showed quite a substantial
difference.
So it's very difficult to think that things have changed that much in such a short space of time. So I think if you take those two together and say, right, we're maybe looking at a kind of average of this. But I do think on polling day, maybe a lot of people who were going to vote, maybe planning on voting Labour, the Labour vote's maybe a bit softer than the SNP vote. I think now, because I think the SNP have plateaued. So I think, or bottomed out, maybe a better term for it. But so I think when the dust settles, it might be a bit tighter than we think.
But Chris, I wonder what your thoughts are on, I mean, there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that people don't actually properly make their mind up until the day, whether that's the day they cast their postal vote or whether that's the day that they go into the polling booth, which obviously will be in July the 4th. And even in those few kind of seconds, people could switch back or forward. I mean, do you think that, like Douglas, that they're broadly correct, or do you think we could see a bit of a surprise in some seats?
When it comes to polling, I always pay attention to what the great Professor John Curtis has to say. And he always repeats the line that you shouldn't look at one poll, you should look at the average polling that's coming in. If you look back at the last 6, 7 or 8 polls that have been taken on a particular subject. And in Scotland, that broadly tells us that Labour are maybe 3 or 4 points ahead of the SNP. I think that's probably roughly where we are right now. And as Douglas points out correctly, an important point to make, that works much more efficiently for Labour because their vote is so concentrated in the Central Belt, whereas the SNP's vote is, nationwide. They're competitive in the northeast of Scotland, they're competitive in the Highlands, in the way that Labour is not, which is why, the Savannah poll for the Scotsman today shows, them neck and neck, but would give Labour potentially 10 more seats. So I think, Labour are confident in Scotland. I think they're not taking anything for granted, certainly from conversations I've had with people today. I think maybe not jittery wouldn't be the right way to put it, but I think they're aware that it's the old cliche, the only poll that matters is the one on July 4th. And I think for Labour that day can't come quick enough. They realise that they're in a good position and they want to get over the line before some unknown comes along and potentially, disrupts them. They just want to get this election done and dusted. I think the point you make, Lorna, though, about undecideds, that's absolutely true. And I think that could be crucial in some seats in Scotland. I mean, the ballot box Scotland poll that the Herald published suggests that up to a quarter of seats in Scotland are too close to call. I think that could be true. I mean, certainly seats like Glasgow East, for example, I would expect to be extremely close. They have been close before. That's been effectively a marginal since 2008 when the SNP won the by-election there. In 2017, they won it by a couple of dozen votes. And I think it could be close this time. I mean, I don't know if it'll come down to double figures, but I know that David Linden, the SNP incumbent, he feels that he's got a fighting chance there. In Glasgow South West, where Chris Stevens is, he's a sitting SNP MP. I was speaking to him last Friday, and he said it was 50-50. Usually MPs just say, I'm having a great response to the doorstep. They all think I'm wonderful. I'm definitely going to win. But Chris Stevens was very honest when he was saying, I've got a battle in my hands, but it's going to be close. And I think he's right there. And I think that could be, we could also see that elsewhere in the Central Belt. Just one seat to bring up briefly in Falkirk, which was the single largest majority for the SNP in 2019. But that was partly because Labour withdrew its support for its candidate. And many people, who may have voted Labour just voted the SNP. But I think this time around, that seat could actually be a lot closer. And I think are really viewing that as one they could win. but there's a week to go. The SNP, I think, will be viewing this week. They'll be encouraged by the polls today. Although, as John Curtis said, mildly, but only mildly encouraging for the SNP. So, shouldn't run away with themselves. There's a lot to do.
If there was one seat that you two could pick that you're most interested to see or think that it could throw up something different, which one, Douglas? What would it be?
Well, I'm obviously always interested in my own Rutherglen seat, and Rutherglen's been in the political news recently, and it's become a bit of a bellwether actually. Kind of going to the SNP, a big shock in 2015, back to Labour 2017, and obviously it's back. Kind of switch hands again. But I think the SNP will hold on in the new Perth and Kinrossshire seat. But I think it'll be really, really interesting to see the majority there. I think the Tories are throwing everything at that. They've got a really good candidate in Luke Graham.
And is Pete Wisher, I mean, he had a huge majority, didn't he?
Well, no, this was the thing. He only held on in 2017 by 21 votes.
Oh, right. Excuse me.
He improved it significantly in 2019. But it's there to be won for the Tories, I think, and the boundary changes as well. Kind of bring in Tory voting areas in Kinrossshire, or traditionally more Tory voting areas in Kinrossshire, where Pete Wisher maybe hasn't stood before. And as he's, the longest serving SNP MP, would be a huge scalp for the Tories to take. And I think that's one that could be, really interesting. I wouldn't put my mortgage on anything there. I think the polls are suggesting that Wisher will hold on, but I'll be keeping a close. Obviously, I used to work up there as well, so I'll be kind of keeping a close eye on that one as well as my own Rutherglen seat.
And what about Douglas Ross's or the seat that he is now standing in? What do you think?
I think he faces issues there. Very tight again. It's one of these seats that's on a knife edge. I think he might be relying on maybe people who might be tempted by reform, not deciding on the day that getting rid of making sure there's not an SNP MP is more important than sending a message to Rishi Sunak or to Douglas Ross, because obviously the way that seat kind of came about, or his nomination as candidate came about, has been quite controversial.
And Chris, is there one that you're particularly interested in looking at, or think that there could be a bit of an upset or some controversy over it?
Well, at the Daily Record, we've been really looking at the battle between SNP and Labour, which has largely been fought in the Central Belt. As Douglas mentions there, I think out with the Central Belt, Douglas Ross's seat, I think he faces quite a tricky task to win that. I think he may come to regret throwing all his eggs in one basket with that. But in terms of a different seat, I think Glasgow's fascinating in a lot of ways, because the SNP spent so long trying to dislodge Labour, from its real citadel that Glasgow was. It was the centre of Scottish Labour for so many decades, and the SNP spent so much time and effort to make a breakthrough. And when it finally came in dribs and drabs in 2011, and then in 2015 they wiped Labour out in Glasgow, such a seismic moment in Scottish politics. But it really could swing the other way. I think there's maybe a few hundred votes in every constituency in Glasgow could settle things. But one in particular I find interesting is Glasgow South. Now, the reason I pick that is partly because it's symbolic. Glasgow South, of course, is where Nicola Sturgeon, that's her power base, it's her effective Holyrood constituency is there. The SNP has been very, very strong there in recent years. And it's also where Anas Sarwar, that's where he stays as well. There's also another aspect of this election being played out in the cities is, the Scottish Greens, are they going to eat into potential SNP votes, and could that cost the SNP if there's a close race with Labour? In Glasgow South, we've got Stuart MacDonald. He's been there since 2015. But the Greens locally in Glasgow South are quite strong. They have big base, a really motivated candidate, Niall Christie. And I know Niall a little bit. I know he's quite confident. He knows he's not going to win in Glasgow South. They want to keep the deposit. They want to show that they can pull in votes. So if the Greens potentially get a few thousand votes in Glasgow South, could that be the difference between the SNP winning or Labour winning? I
think what's fascinating from what you two are saying is that it could be, it's all these smaller parties, like who could actually define what happens, including Reform, including possibly Alba in some seats, obviously. And as you say, Chris, the Greens. I think, there might be a story in all of that come the 5th. So here's the final thing I wanted to ask you about. Since it looks like the election debates on television are becoming far less popular than watching the Euros, even though Scotland are out, England aren't doing particularly well. Is this down to the format and the scripted answers again, or is it just that we've now had enough of politics? Douglas?
I think people have just had enough. I think everything about it, the format, the Euros, everything. I mean, who would rather have watched Starmer and Sunak last night than Georgia beating Portugal, one of the great upsets in Euros history? I mean, it's an absolute no-brainer for me, but other people might think differently. But I find them really quite depressing. I find them a bit pointless. I think it's easy to forget that this is quite a new thing. Mm-hmm. These kind of debates. I mean, we're only going back 14 years, I think. If it kind of started in 2010, we've done perfectly well without them for 100 years. I don't really understand why they've become such a thing.
I think it's the fact there's so many of them. It's literally every second night. Yeah, and I think people will switch off.
Yeah, and I think we discussed in a previous episode, Lorna, you did a Scottish leaders debate night, and at that point, not a single person was standing in the actual general election. Obviously, Douglas Ross is now standing in the general election, but at the time, it was people who. And they spent the whole night discussing devolved issues. So I just don't see the Starmer Sunak ones make me uncomfortable because we don't have a presidential system. I understand that realistically, these are the only two guys who have any chance of being Prime Minister, although the polls are suggesting maybe only one of them has a chance of being Prime Minister. But we don't have a presidential system here. You elect someone in your constituency to represent your constituency, and then the biggest party gets the opportunity to form a government. I just find the whole thing a complete turn off. It's the same. They go over the same ground. People don't change their mind. If they did, Rishi Sunak wouldn't be 20. Keir Starmer would be 20-25% ahead in the polls because he's dreadful at them. So it's a real kind of. I don't really.
But does that matter, Dougie? I mean, that's the thing. There are some people who can perform, obviously, on television really well, but I suppose we're looking for, somebody who can, lead the country and perhaps with a bit of integrity and honesty for a change.
No, I don't think that does matter, but I also think, and sorry, Lorna, in this election specifically, it doesn't matter how they perform even more because people's minds have been made up. People's minds were made up in this one after Partygate and incidents like this. It doesn't, Sir Keir Starmer could come up and come out with some ludicrous policy about, an extra £1,000 tax on everyone's second child. And I think he would still win the election because people's minds were made up weeks ago, and we're now, with a week to go, Chris is absolutely right, incidentally, Labour just want to get this over and done with, but I think we're so close to it now that I don't think it's going to make any, even if Labour were engulfed in some scandal, I don't think that there's enough time for that to filter through to enough people to make any real difference. And I find them a real turn off, if I'm being honest.
Chris, what's your view on these kind of things? Do they work? Do they not?
The points you made, they're all correct. There's a problem with the format. We still don't have the ideal format. Do we have just the leader of Labour and Conservatives because they're the only two people that can become Prime Minister? Do we only have parties that have MPs? Do we include parties that are polling really strongly like Reform? Because we're in a multi-party democracy, it's not a presidential election, as Douglas says. It's not like the US. We don't just have two candidates. Nobody can quite make up their mind on what they want from these. And then we also throw into the mix, do we have the Scottish party leaders? It's just too many of them. It's too many programmes. And, I'm all for, having, say, one on ITV, one on Sky and one on BBC, and that be it. I don't think we need, even as Scottish political journalists, I don't think we need to hear from the Holyrood party leaders on a general election campaign in a debate format. They have their say, umpteen other places to do that. More generally, do they change people's minds? I think the first debate in every election campaign, I think there is always an interest, and I think they do get relatively large audiences. But I think by the time the last night's one on the BBC in Nottingham, I think a lot of people had either tuned out or were just doing other things. The Euros is on, the football's on, it's summer, it's light evenings. People are going out and living their lives and enjoying a bit of downtime. But Rishi Sunak chose to call an election campaign during this. Presumably his team factored this in. But I think a lot of people have either made up their minds of how they're going to vote, or they've chosen to zone out completely. They'll maybe engage next week when it actually comes to the crunch and they go to cast ballots. Yeah. But I think right now, no, most people don't want to watch these debates. Just briefly on a tangent point, I also just find it quite sad that this campaign, we've seen a real lack of what I would call sort of street campaigning. The old days when you would see party leaders in like a market square or a shopping centre, pressing the flesh, shaking hands with people, the cliched kissing babies. All of that seems to have kind of vanished from this campaign, partly because of security concerns. We live in volatile times and there are various complex issues going on that they don't want big party leaders mixing in crowds and they feel it's not safe. But I feel we have lost something from that. That was a big British campaign tradition. The public could get up close to candidates and, buttonhole them and complain about the local hospital and all of that. There's been very, very little of this in this campaign. And I feel that... Yeah,
again, you're right, Chris. It's all stage managed. And they would rather do these scripted TV kind of interviews than anything else. You can understand why. They're terrified, both, I think, of something happening, events that are out with their control. And, then that becomes it. But you're wrong because, politicians should be seen and you should be able to speak to them and ask them and confront them, obviously in a respectful manner, whether you agree or disagree. But, it's definitely lacking. Well, listen, thank you both very much for joining me, Chris and Douglas. You can watch Planet Holyrood on the Daily Record YouTube channel and obviously listen to it on Spotify. And we'll be back tomorrow.
It's important we look at the facts. Politics has to be about service.
A modern form of national service.
The outcome, that's for the voters to decide.